She never planned to fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder, but when she woke up, the man beside her was not just anyone, and what he did while she slept left her speechless. The morning train from Boston to Washington hummed like a tired heartbeat under a sky dusted with snow. Outside the platform, lights flickered against the drifting flakes, and the loudspeaker called the last boarding for the 6:45 Amtrak. Inside the station, Harper Lane clutched a paper cup of cheap coffee that had long gone cold. She was 29, a freelance illustrator, living from commission to commission, and this trip was her last attempt to convince a small Washington publisher to take her children's book sketches. Her backpack was heavy, her laptop battery blinking red, her eyes burning from a night without sleep. She found her seat near the window car 14 seat 9A. Beside her a man sat already settled coat, folded neatly on his lap, a pair of noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck. He was reading a hardback book titled The Art of Stillness. His hair dark, slightly tousled, his features calm in the early light. He looked like someone who had seen too much of the world and was quietly trying to forget it. Harper slid into her seat, whispered a polite good morning, and opened her laptop. The screen's glow reflected off the window, showing her pale face, framed by a messy bun, and the faint worry of a woman chasing deadlines. She began to sketch, but the rhythmic sway of the train, the soft heat from the vents, and the muffled sound of snow against glass slowly melted her focus. The man beside her glanced once at her screen, noticing a drawing of a small girl chasing stars across a night sky. There was tenderness in the lines, even through exhaustion. When Harper rubbed her eyes and sighed, he quietly reached for the blanket folded above their seats. He hesitated, then decided against it. Instead, he unfolded his own wool coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. She startled for a second, then mumbled a tired thank you before sleep caught her mid-sentence. Her head tilted sideways, brushing his arm, and then settling lightly against his shoulder. He froze the way someone does when reminded of a memory too fragile to touch. For a few seconds, he almost moved away, but then he saw the dark circles under her eyes, the trembling of her fingers as they relaxed, and he stayed perfectly still. The train slid past frozen rivers and silent forests. Passengers scrolled through phones or stared at their reflections. But in seat 9A and 9B, there was an odd stillness, as if the noise of the world had been turned down. The man turned slightly, looking at her profile. There was a pencil mark smudged near her wrist and a tiny bandage on her finger. She looked fragile but determined, like someone who had learned to survive on little sleep and stubborn hope. He smiled a small, sad smile, and then without thinking, reached into his leather case, pulled out a slim power bank, and connected it to the laptop resting on her knees. The screen blinked alive, charging silently. He returned to his book, but did not read a word. Instead, he stared out the window at the blur of snow and thought about his late wife, the one who used to fall asleep in airports on long business trips, the one who said that sometimes strangers are angels in disguise. When the conductor passed, he raised a hand for silence and whispered softly, "Please do not wake her." The hours moved slowly. Outside, the winter morning turned pale gold. A child laughed in another car. The smell of coffee drifted through the aisle. The world went on. And yet, in that small shared space, something quiet unfolded, a fragile thread of kindness stretching between two lives that would soon intersect again. 2 hours later, the train rattled through Maryland, and Harper stirred. Her head lifted abruptly, and she blinked, confused by the warmth beneath her cheek. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," she whispered, straightening up. The man removed his headphones, smiling gently. "It is all right. You looked like you needed the rest." She noticed the coat still on her shoulders, the steady charge icon on her screen. Her battery had been dying before she fell asleep. Now it was full. She frowned, looked at the power bank resting on the tray. "I think this is yours." He nodded lightly. "Your laptop was almost out. Did not want you to wake to a dead screen." Harper stared at him, then laughed softly. The kind of laugh that trembles between gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quieter. No one had done something that thoughtful for her in a long time. The man nodded, once his eyes returning to the blur of passing towns. Outside, the sky cleared, revealing thin rays of sunlight touching the snow-covered tracks. For a moment, neither spoke. Harper looked at him uncertainly, wondering who he was and why his calm felt oddly familiar, like a song she had forgotten. The train began to slow, approaching its next stop. She closed her laptop, adjusted his coat around her shoulders, and whispered, "Thank you again for the seat, for the sleep, for the charger." He only smiled faintly, still watching the horizon. When she turned back to the window, she caught their reflections side by side, framed by streaks of melting frost. And for a reason she could not explain, Harper felt that something in her life had quietly shifted. The train moved steadily south as morning light softened over the Massachusetts countryside. Harper tucked her sketchbook back into her backpack and sipped the lukewarm coffee that no longer tasted of anything. Her cheeks still burned faintly from embarrassment. She replayed the image of herself asleep on the stranger's shoulder and felt both mortified and oddly safe. He had not looked annoyed or smug, just quietly kind. She noticed now that he sat with an easy stillness rare in men who travel alone. His phone was face down on the tray table, untouched since the train left Boston. Instead, he read a small paperback, whose pages were marked with faint folds and underlines. Every so often, he looked out the window, his gaze traveling across the snow-covered fields, like someone who had once owned time and had decided to give it back. Harper studied him the way an artist studies light. There was something precise in the way he moved, careful, without being stiff. He seemed like a man accustomed to silence someone who carried his solitude with grace. She wondered if he was married, if someone waited for him at the other end of the line, and then scolded herself for caring. She returned to her laptop. The screen lit up with a half-finished drawing of a child reaching for a paper star. It had been meant for her presentation, the one that might change her career. If she could sell her idea to the publisher. She added a few strokes, fixing the girl's eyes, then saved her file. Her heart was already heavy with the thought of all the rent bills she had pushed off. If this project failed, she would have to return to doing product sketches for online stores, soulless work that drained the color out of her days. The man beside her glanced briefly at her screen again, curious but respectful. "You draw for a living?" he asked quietly. Harper hesitated. "Try to." She smiled, self-deprecating. "Illustrations, mostly children's stories. Not exactly Wall Street material." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she said. "That must take patience. It takes coffee and cheap rent," she replied. They both laughed softly, the sound barely louder than the train wheels. "I am Adrian," he said after a moment, offering his hand. "Harper," she answered, shaking it. His grip was firm but unassuming. she noticed the faint scar across his thumb, a detail that would have been easy to miss if she were not trained to notice small flaws that make people real. He turned back to his book, but curiosity lingered between them. Adrian West, though she did not know his last name yet, was a man once synonymous with success. At 37, he had built West Analytics, a company that had reshaped data security, before selling it to a global conglomerate for hundreds of millions. The sale had made him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America, but it had also broken something quietly inside him. After his wife's death in a plane crash 3 years earlier, he had left the corporate world and withdrawn from the spotlight entirely. Now he traveled rarely, preferring the trains over jets, the slow rhythm of wheels over the sterile hum of airports. He did not need anyone to know who he was anymore. Harper saw only a man in a gray coat who smelled faintly of cedar and rain. She leaned her head against the cold glass and watched the towns slide by. Children in bright coats ran along school fences. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Life went on. In her chest was the familiar ache of distance, the feeling of watching other people's stories, while her own remained unwritten. Adrian noticed the quiet slump of her shoulders and the fading warmth in her eyes. He recognized that exhaustion. He had lived inside it for years. Without thinking too much, he reached into his leather satchel and pulled out the small power bank again, checking that her laptop still charged. "Her battery is fine now," she said softly, catching him. He smiled, faintly amused. "Just making sure the world doesn't shut down on you mid-dream." She tilted her head. "You sound like you've had the world shut down on you before." "Maybe I have," he answered. The train curved along the river, gliding through New Haven, the windows filled with reflections of other passengers' businessmen. Asleep, a mother soothing her toddler, a teenage boy listening to music. It was a cross-section of ordinary life, the kind Adrian had once lost touch with. Harper pulled her coat tighter and studied her seatmate from the corner of her eye. The lines near his temples, the controlled calm, the slight sadness that never quite left his face. He was clearly someone used to responsibility, but not the kind that craves attention. She felt a sudden impulse to sketch him, to capture the contradiction of power and gentleness, but stopped herself. He would probably think it strange. Instead, she said, "You travel often." "Less than I used to." He closed the book, carefully marking the page with an old boarding pass. "I used to fly everywhere. Now I prefer trains. They let you remember that moving can still mean seeing." She smiled faintly. "That sounds poetic for an engineer." He did not correct her assumption. Maybe engineers need poetry more than most. The train rocked lightly through a tunnel, the sound filling the small silence between them. Harper realized she felt calmer sitting next to him than she had in months. No pitch, no pressure, just the steady rhythm of the tracks and the stranger's quiet presence. Adrian studied her reflection again in the glass. She reminded him of someone. He used to be a person who believed that small things mattered. The sun rose higher, washing the snow in pale gold. Harper opened her sketchbook once more. She drew a figure on a train window, a shadow leaning toward another. When she finished, she looked at it and then at the man beside her. The drawing felt alive. Maybe art, she thought, only happens when two worlds accidentally meet. At that moment, Adrian turned to her and said, almost as if reading her thought, "I used to believe that people meet by coincidence. I am starting to think we meet because we are meant to be mirrors." Harper blinked, unsure how to respond. The train whistle echoed through the valley, soft and distant. For the first time in years, she felt seen. He returned his gaze to the horizon. She closed her sketchbook slowly, knowing without understanding why that the rest of this journey would stay with her long after the train reached its destination. The train rolled through Connecticut, the gray sky thinning into silver light. Harper's stomach grumbled softly, reminding her she had not eaten since the night before. She pressed her hands around the warm paper cup of coffee she'd bought hours earlier, hoping it would quiet the emptiness. Adrian noticed, though he pretended not to. He watched her open her email, frown at a message, and close the laptop again. When the attendant came down the aisle with a small cart, Adrian gestured quietly. A few minutes later, the attendant returned and placed a steaming latte and a muffin on Harper's tray. "From the gentleman in seat 9B, he said. Harper blinked, startled. She turned toward Adrian, her cheeks pink from the sudden attention. "You didn't have to do that," she said, half smiling, half embarrassed. "You looked like someone who forgets breakfast," he replied simply. She laughed, the sound soft but genuine, and for a second the space between them felt lighter. The smell of cinnamon and coffee lingered in the air, and the train rattled on. Harper hesitated before taking a sip, the foam leaving a faint mark on her lip. "Thank you," she said, quieter this time. He nodded once, turning his gaze back toward the window, but his lips curved faintly upward. The kindness was small, ordinary even yet. It carried a weight that Harper could not name. No one had done something thoughtful for her without expecting something in return for a long time. In her world, kindness was currency rarely exchanged. She took a small bite of the muffin and felt warmth spread through her chest. "I am heading to Washington to pitch my first book," she said after a while. "It's a children's story. If they like it, they might give me a contract. And if not," she shrugged, "I will go back to sketching shoe ads." Adrian turned his head slightly, listening. "What kind of story?" he asked. "It's about a little girl who draws stars for people who forget how to see them." "Children's books," she said, "because kids still see magic where adults only see math." He smiled faintly at that, his expression softening. "That's beautiful," he murmured. Harper looked at him more closely. His face seemed built for stillness, yet his eyes carried depth, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and said too little. She noticed the faint stubble on his jaw, the elegant simplicity of his watch, and thought how strange it was that someone like him was riding a morning train instead of a private jet. Maybe he liked anonymity. Or maybe, like her, he was running from something. She brushed the thought aside. "So what about you?" she asked. "What do you do?" He paused as if considering the right version of the truth. "I used to run a company. Now I mostly try to remember what quiet sounds like. That sounds poetic for a businessman." "Maybe I was in the wrong business," he said. She smiled, feeling the tension dissolve again. The train curved along the frozen river. The scenery outside looked like watercolor soft edges of white and gray. Harper leaned closer to the glass, drawing little circles in the fog with her fingertip. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked suddenly. Adrian looked at her reflection. "I used to believe in control," he said. "Then life convinced me otherwise." Harper's laugh came with a small exhale, the kind that hides sadness. That's comforting and terrifying at the same time. "Most true things are," he said. The conversation drifted into silence, the kind that felt safe. Harper turned a page in her sketchbook and began to draw without thinking. The pencil moved with quiet confidence. She drew a train window, a coffee cup, a man reading. Adrian watched her hand move, fascinated by how effortlessly she created form from blankness. He thought of the servers and codes he once built, how sterile it all seemed, compared to this someone turning graphite into feeling. He realized he envied her ability to translate life into lines. The train passed a small bridge, sunlight glinting briefly off the river below. Harper shaded the outline of his coat and stopped, embarrassed. "Sorry," she said, "it's a habit." He tilted his head. "Drawing strangers." "Drawing moments," she corrected. "They disappear otherwise." "That's an artist's way of holding on," he said quietly. She nodded, pretending not to notice the way his gaze lingered on her. When the conductor announced the next stop, she leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels made her drowsy again, but this time she stayed awake. Her thoughts wandered to how easily kindness could change the tone of a day. Maybe that was what art tried to do, too, to give something back to the world that asked for nothing. Adrian ordered another coffee, black this time. He took a sip and let his mind drift. He had spent years surrounded by people who chased profit, not purpose. Yet here was a woman who measured her worth in drawings and quiet persistence. He wondered what she would think if she knew who he was. Probably nothing flattering, he thought. He smiled inwardly. When Harper opened her eyes again, she found him studying the snowy landscape. "You travel alone often?" she asked. "Usually," he said. "Why trains?" she pressed. "Because they remind me that moving can still mean seeing," he replied. She liked that answer. She wrote it lightly in the corner of her sketchbook, as if saving it for later. The attendant returned down the aisle, checking tickets. Harper reached for her wallet, but Adrian had already handed over both of theirs. She frowned. "You didn't need to do that. I can pay for mine." He looked at her calmly. "You can pay for the next coffee," he said. She rolled her eyes but smiled anyway. "Deal." As the train sped onward, she noticed her reflection beside his. In the window, two strangers sharing the same small patch of morning light. She realized then that kindness, even from someone you may never see again, had a way of stitching invisible threads between lives. Outside, the snow began to fade into rain, washing the horizon clean. Inside, something quiet unfolded between them, fragile and steady, like the rhythm of the rails. Harper picked up her pencil again and began to draw the river, this time adding a faint line of sunlight breaking through the clouds. She signed it with tiny letters at the bottom corner, "For the man who remembered breakfast." The rain streaked down the train windows in long, quiet lines as the Amtrak glided through Delaware. Harper flipped through her sketchbook absent-mindedly, half lost in thought, half aware of the man sitting beside her, who seemed to fill the small space with calm. Adrian had removed his coat and folded it neatly on the rack. He sat with one hand resting against his chin, the book he had been reading earlier now closed on the tray. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but rhythmic like breathing. Harper could sense the faint scent of cedar from his coat, the understated warmth that had settled between them since breakfast. She finally spoke without looking up from her drawings. "My mother used to tell me that kindness is the art that never fades. She said it while teaching me to paint clouds when I was 7. Adrian turned his gaze toward her, his voice low. "She must have been a remarkable woman." Harper smiled softly, the kind that hides both pride and pain. "She was," she said, "until she got sick. Cancer. I was in college then. She made me promise to keep drawing no matter what. Even if no one saw it, sometimes I think I broke that promise. Adrian studied her face. You didn't break it, he said quietly. You're still drawing. She shrugged. I draw for deadlines, not for joy. There's a difference. He nodded as if he understood more than he wanted to admit. What about you, she asked. Do you draw or build or fix something? He hesitated for a second, the question pressing against a door he rarely opened. I used to run a company, he said finally. Now I'm just trying to build something quieter. Harper looked up at him. You sound like a poet who lost his pen. Adrian smiled faintly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Maybe I did, he said. His voice was almost a whisper. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the hum of the train wrapping around them like white noise. Then the attendant passed by again, offering more drinks. Adrian raised a hand slightly, ordering another coffee for himself and a hot chocolate for her without asking. Harper frowned when the cups arrived. You don't need to do that, she said, reaching for her purse. He stopped her with a calm shake of his head. It's just a drink. Consider it my apology for the accidental pillow incident earlier. She laughed. If anything, I should apologize. I drooled on your shoulder. He grinned for the first time, the kind of smile that made him look younger, softer. Did you? He teased. I didn't notice. You're lying. Possibly, he said, his tone playful but gentle. They both sipped in silence for a while. Harper felt the warmth of the chocolate spread through her, grounding her. She glanced sideways at him again, trying to read him. He had the air of someone who had lived too long behind glass walls, and suddenly stepped outside into real air. After a few minutes, he flagged the attendant again. Harper thought he was about to order more coffee. Instead, she saw him hand over a folded bill and whisper something. The attendant nodded politely and moved away. Harper frowned. You don't need to do that, whatever it is, she said, misunderstanding. I don't want you to pity me. Adrian turned toward her, the gentleness in his expression unshaken. It's not pity, Harper. It's respect. You work for what you love. That's rarer than money. The words settled between them like a small storm. Harper blinked, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. She looked away toward the window, pretending to watch the landscape. He continued quietly. I've met hundreds of people who had everything but heart. You're the first I've met in a long time who has heart even when she's running on empty. She did not know how to answer. The train entered a long stretch of track that crossed a steel bridge. Beneath them, the river mirrored the gray sky, and for a second she saw their reflections side by side, framed by rain and light. She wondered how someone like him could see her that clearly. Harper forced a small laugh to hide her unease. You talk like someone who writes self-help books. Adrian smiled. I suppose I'm helping myself. She turned to him again. Why are you going to Washington business? He hesitated. A meeting, he said vaguely, with investors. It wasn't entirely a lie. Harper nodded. She imagined him in boardrooms with glass walls, the kind of place where people wore confidence like armor. And yet here he was sitting quietly on a train, drinking black coffee. The contradiction fascinated her. When the train slowed at a small station, a gust of cold air slipped in through the door. Adrian noticed Harper shiver and reached for his coat again, placing it over her shoulders without asking. She looked up, startled, and then smiled in gratitude. You really need to stop being nice, she said. I'm starting to expect it. He met her gaze and replied softly, Maybe you should. The way he said it was neither flirtation nor apology. It was simple, sincere, and it caught her completely off guard. She swallowed and looked down at her hands, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. Her heart beat unevenly, not in romance yet, but in recognition. She felt seen in a way that scared her. The train picked up speed. Again the sound of wheels on rails, a steady heartbeat beneath them. Adrian leaned back, watching the world blur into streaks of gray and white. He thought of his wife's words from years ago. She had once told him that success without silence is just noise. Sitting beside Harper, he felt the faint echo of that truth return. Harper, meanwhile, tried to focus on the page in front of her. She began to sketch again, lines forming quickly, instinctively. When she finished, she closed the book and turned it toward him. It was a simple pencil drawing of two figures seated on a train, their reflections merging in the glass. "You drew this just now?" he asked. She nodded. "It's what I see," she said. He studied it for a long moment. The likeness was uncanny. He could almost feel the hum of the rails through the page. "It's beautiful," he said finally. She smiled shyly. "It's not finished. Neither are we," he said quietly. She froze, not sure what he meant. When she looked up, his gaze was on the window again, distant but kind. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds in long golden threads. The world looked newly washed. Harper felt the moment stretch fragile and full. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words would not come. So she just whispered, "Thank you for the hot chocolate, for everything." Adrian nodded once. "You're welcome." The rest of the car fell into a hush, passengers lost in their own worlds. The faint sound of a child laughing somewhere behind them filled the air, blending with the soft clatter of the wheels. Harper leaned her head lightly against the seat, her eyes closing. In that moment between motion and stillness, she felt the rare peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Adrian looked at her one last time before turning away. He did not know why he felt protective of a woman he had just met, only that her presence had brought a small warmth back into a part of him he thought had gone cold. Outside, the light followed the train, tracing their reflections in the glass. Like a promise neither of them yet understood. The afternoon light slanted through the train windows, washing the cabin in pale gold. The snow outside had softened into a gentle drizzle, blurring the towns into watercolor smudges. Harper sat quietly, her sketchbook open but untouched. Her pencil rested against the paper, but she wasn't drawing. The rhythm of the train seemed to echo her thoughts, steady, distant, and slightly melancholic. Adrian sat beside her, one hand tracing idle lines along the spine of his closed book. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer tentative, but thoughtful, as if words might break something delicate forming in the air. Harper finally spoke, her voice soft. "My mom used to say that art isn't about talent. It's about staying when everything else leaves." He looked at her, curious. Did everything leave Harper? She smiled faintly, her eyes unfocused. She did. Cancer. It happened faster than anyone prepared for. I was still in school. She was my only family, so when she went, everything felt smaller, quieter. Adrian nodded slowly. "I know that kind of quiet," he said. She turned toward him. "What about you?" His gaze drifted to the window, where raindrops chased each other down the glass. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. Plane crash over Denver. She was a sound engineer, spent her life capturing noises most people never notice. Wind against glass church bells through fog children, laughing in parks. She said silence scared her. Harper listened, the details forming pictures in her mind. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "Grief has a strange sound," he continued. "It's not crying, not breaking things. It's the echo that stays after everything else stops." Harper looked down at her hands. "That's why you like trains," she said quietly. "They sound like memory." He turned to her, surprised at how accurate that felt. Maybe, he admitted, when you've lived surrounded by noise meetings, interviews, markets, silence becomes unbearable. But here it's not empty, it's moving. Harper traced a circle on the fogged window, then looked at him. "So you ran a company?" she said, piecing together what little he had shared. He nodded. "West Analytics, data systems. I started it when I was 27, sold it at 36. On paper, I won. In life, I lost more than I could count." She tilted her head. "That's why you said you're building something quieter now." He smiled sadly. "I thought if I stepped away, I could find peace. But it turns out peace doesn't come from leaving. It comes from learning how to stay." Harper's chest tightened at the honesty in his tone. It was rare to hear someone speak without polishing their words first. She hesitated before saying, "My mom used to record rain. She said every storm had a rhythm. When she was gone, I played those recordings on nights I couldn't sleep. It helped." Adrian looked at her, and for a moment he wasn't on a train. He was in a quiet apartment filled with the hum of grief and pencil scratches on paper. "I think she'd be proud," he said softly. Harper gave a small smile. "Maybe. She always said kindness is the only real inheritance. But I haven't been very kind to myself." Adrian leaned back, watching her profile. "You're still here, still trying. That's kindness enough." The train curved the wheels, screeching softly as they passed over a bridge. Below, the water shimmered gray under the setting sun. Harper pulled her knees closer, hugging her sketchbook like a shield. "Can I tell you something strange?" she asked. He nodded. "Sometimes I feel guilty when I'm happy, like I owe her my sadness." Adrian's voice was quiet. "Guilt is love that doesn't know where to go." Her breath caught. He added, "My wife used to say that the world doesn't need perfect people. It needs people who keep showing up. You're one of them." Harper stared at the reflection of their faces in the glass. His eyes were kind but distant, as though they were looking at something she couldn't see. She wanted to ask more, but feared she might cross into a place too private to enter. Instead, she turned her sketchbook around and began to draw. Her hand moved faster, this time the pencil scratching rhythmically. Adrian watched without interrupting. He saw the outline of a suspension bridge, two figures framed in a window, a river flowing beneath them. He realized she was drawing this exact moment. The image felt alive, almost sacred. When she finished, she looked at it and then at him. "You think silence has a melody," she said. He nodded. "My wife used to say that too. Maybe that's what I'm still chasing, the melody inside silence." Harper handed him the sketch. "Keep it," she said. He hesitated. Why? Because moments disappear. Drawings don't. He accepted it carefully, running his fingers over the pencil lines. "Thank you, Harper." "For what?" "For listening," he said simply. "For not trying to fix it." She smiled, though her eyes glistened. "You don't need fixing, Adrian. Just remembering." They sat in silence again, but now it felt different, anchored alive. The sky outside deepened into violet, the first lights of evening flickering through small towns. Harper leaned back and closed her eyes. Adrian studied her quietly. In her face he saw traces of every choice he had never made, to rest, to forgive himself, to start again. He wondered if meeting her was coincidence or mercy. The train slowed as it approached Wilmington. Passengers shifted, stretching legs, adjusting coats. A faint announcement crackled overhead, muffled by static. Harper opened her eyes and looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The city lights blurred into amber streaks. "You ever think about starting again?" she asked. "All the time," he said. "But the hardest part isn't starting. It's believing you deserve to." She looked at him and saw a truth that resonated in her bones. Maybe that was what she had been missing, not opportunity, but permission. The train picked up speed again. She glanced down at his hands resting on the sketch. His fingers were calloused in places where she hadn't expected. "You paint?" she asked softly. He smiled. "I used to play piano. I stopped when she died." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a tiny travel watercolor kit. It looked worn, the colors nearly gone. She placed it on his tray. "For you," she said, "so the silence can sing again." He looked at the small box as if it were a relic. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I can always buy another, but maybe you need this more." He exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he said. And it was not a casual thank you. It carried weight. He placed the kit beside the sketch she had given him and stared out the window again. The train lights flickered as they entered a tunnel. In the dark reflection, their faces merged for a second, blurred into one shape before separating again when light returned. Neither spoke. When they emerged into open fields, Harper whispered almost to herself, "Maybe peace isn't a place. Maybe it's a person who listens." Adrian turned, met her eyes, and said softly, "Maybe it's both." The train continued its steady rhythm southward. Two strangers side by side, both scarred, both searching, both beginning to remember what it meant to feel alive. The train crossed into Maryland under a pale, rain-washed sky. Afternoon had folded into that quiet hour between light and dusk when everything feels suspended, like the world is waiting to exhale. Harper sat with her sketchbook open on her lap, though she was no longer drawing. The pages fluttered slightly in the draft of the cabin. Her mind kept drifting back to her email inbox, to the message that had arrived an hour ago, the one she still hadn't opened. Adrian noticed her staring at the screen, her lips pressed tightly together. "Bad news?" he asked gently. She blinked as if pulled from a trance. "It's nothing, just work." He watched her close the laptop a little too quickly. She turned toward the window, pretending to focus on the scenery, but her reflection gave her away. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes glassy. He waited. Silence had a way of loosening truth. Finally, she sighed. "It's the publisher. They canceled my meeting. The email says their schedule changed, which means they found someone better." Adrian leaned back. "I doubt that." Harper gave a brittle laugh. "You're kind, but it's the reality of my field. There's always someone younger, faster, with better connections. It's like the world keeps reminding me I'm replaceable. No one who draws from their heart is replaceable," he said quietly. She looked at him sharply, almost defensive. "You sound like someone who can afford to say that." He didn't answer. His gaze fell to his hands, fingers tightening around the paper cup. For a moment, his eyes went distant, haunted. Harper immediately regretted the edge in her tone. "I didn't mean it like that," she said. He shook his head. "It's fine, you're right. I can afford a lot of things, just not peace." She studied him, unsure what he meant, but his expression had already softened again. The train slowed at a small station, letting a few passengers off. The platform glistened under the fading light. Harper pressed her forehead to the cool glass. I just thought this trip might finally change something. I needed a break, she whispered. Adrian's voice came low. Sometimes the break we need isn't success. It's someone reminding us we matter even when we fail. She looked at him and smiled weakly. That sounds poetic for an engineer. He smiled back, the smallest hint of irony in his eyes. Maybe I've been mislabeled. They didn't talk much after that. Harper rested her head against the seat, watching the world blur past. The hum of the train was hypnotic, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Adrian stared straight ahead, mind turning over what he had just heard. Replaceable. It was the same word investors used when they sold his company after his wife's death. He had built an empire only to realize he had built it without a soul. Now here sat this young artist holding a broken dream with the same quiet dignity he had once lost. He felt something shift inside him, a decision forming before he could name it. When the train finally began its descent toward Washington, the announcement crackled overhead. Harper stirred, blinking out of her thoughts. "I guess this is goodbye soon," she said. He nodded. "I suppose so." She hesitated, then smiled. "Thank you, Adrian, for the coffee, for the shoulder, for the charger. You've been unexpectedly kind." He returned her smile. "You'll get where you're meant to go, Harper." She frowned slightly, the phrasing catching her off guard. "How do you know my name?" He nodded toward her backpack. "Your name tag." She laughed quietly, embarrassed. "Right, of course." As the train pulled into the station, passengers stood gathering coats and bags. The moment stretched thin, between them fragile, like the pause before a goodbye. That means more than either of them will admit. Harper wanted to say something, ask for his number, maybe offer her email, but her courage failed her. Some people belong to moments, not lifetimes, she thought. She picked up her things and stood. "I hope you find your quiet," she said softly. He looked up. "And I hope you never stop drawing." The doors opened. The sound of footsteps and distant announcements flooded the cabin. Harper gave a small wave before stepping out onto the platform. She turned once, but Adrian was already lost in the crowd. The train departed minutes later, taking him away toward a different destination, and with it, the strange calm she hadn't realized she'd grown used to. Harper walked through the bustling station, swallowed by noise and light. That night, back in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, she unpacked her bag. The sketch she had drawn on the train was slightly smudged. She set it on her desk beside her mother's old paintbrushes and stared at it for a long time. The silence felt heavy again. She opened her laptop, reread the email from the publisher, and closed it. "Maybe tomorrow," she whispered. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in her mailbox. It bore a gold-embossed seal that read, "West Foundation for the Arts." Inside was a letter. "Dear Ms. Lane, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as this year's recipient of the Artist Kindness Grant, awarded to individuals whose work reflects empathy, resilience, and hope. Enclosed you will find the initial grant of $50,000 to support your upcoming projects." Harper read the letter twice, convinced it was a mistake. She had never applied for such a thing. At the bottom of the letter was a handwritten note in blue ink. "Dear Harper, I haven't stopped thinking about our train ride. Your art and your kindness reminded me that beauty isn't gone. It's just quiet, waiting for someone brave enough to notice it again. Please don't see this as charity. Think of it as an investment in kindness. The world needs what you carry. Adrian West." The check was clipped beneath his signature. Harper's breath caught. She dropped into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Adrian West, the name echoed. She opened her laptop and typed it into Google. The search results exploded. Forbes covers business conferences, philanthropy features. Billionaire tech visionary. Adrian West donates millions to arts education. Her eyes widened. The man from the train, the quiet stranger who had shared his coat, his coffee, his charger. She felt dizzy, her mind racing through every small moment they'd shared. The way he'd deflected questions about his work, the sadness in his eyes, the precision in his movements. He wasn't just a businessman escaping noise. He was a man rebuilding meaning from it. Tears blurred her vision. She clutched the letter to her chest, half laughing, half crying. "Thank you," she whispered into the empty room. "Thank you for seeing me." Outside, rain tapped against the window, steady and rhythmic, like the train's heartbeat. Harper pulled her sketchbook closer and began to draw again. Not from memory this time, but from feeling. She drew the train window, the reflection of two people side by side, and beneath it she wrote quietly, "The world runs on noise, kindness travels quietly." When she was done, she tore the page carefully from the book, framed it, and placed it above her desk. She stared at it until the edges of the moment blurred into calm. Somewhere in Maine, miles away, Adrian West sat at a wooden desk overlooking the ocean. A single envelope lay open beside him. Inside was a thank you card covered in watercolor splashes of blue and gold. The message was short. "You were right. Silence does have a melody. Thank you for hearing mine." He smiled faintly, folding the card closed. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, whispering in tones only he seemed to understand. Maybe he thought kindness didn't need an audience. Maybe it was enough that it moved quietly from one heart to another, changing the world in small, invisible ways. The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the city washed in pale light. Harper woke to the sound of her phone buzzing beside her bed. Dozens of unread messages blinked across the screen. Congratulations from other artists, an invitation from a gallery in Soho, even an article online about the mysterious billionaire who had started funding independent creators. She turned the screen face down her heart, still full from the night before. The letter from Adrian West lay on her desk, its edges slightly curled, where her hands had gripped it too tightly. The check was untouched, still tucked inside. She couldn't bring herself to cash it yet. It didn't feel like money. It felt like a promise. She sat at the small table by the window, the one her mother used to paint by, and began to write. Her handwriting was slow and looping, each word carrying the weight of her gratitude. "Dear Adrian," she began, "I don't know how to thank you. You've changed something in me, something I didn't know needed changing. You reminded me that kindness isn't noise, it's the silence that heals. I thought art was what I did. You showed me it's who I am. With love and gratitude, Harper Lane." She stared at the words for a long time before folding the letter neatly. Then she slipped it into an envelope along with a small sketch. It was a copy of the one she had drawn on the train, refined now with watercolors. Two reflections on a rain-streaked window, one man, one woman, the faint outline of light joining them. Beneath it, she wrote a single line, "Sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest echoes." She mailed it the same afternoon, her breath misting in the cold, as she dropped it into the blue postbox on the corner. The moment felt strangely ceremonial, like setting something free. A week later, in a weathered house overlooking the cliffs of coastal Maine, Adrian West received that envelope. He had been spending most of his days in solitude, splitting his time between morning walks along the shore and rebuilding old wooden radios in his study. The sound of static comforted him. It was chaos turned soft. When he saw the return address, Harper Lane, Brooklyn, he paused. He didn't open it right away. He carried it to his desk, set it beside the framed photograph of his late wife, and waited until the evening light fell golden through the window before carefully slicing it open. The letter unfolded in his hands like a whisper. He read each line slowly, his throat tightening. Then he pulled out the sketch. The watercolor glowed under the amber light, delicate yet alive. His fingers traced the edges, feeling the faint ridges of pencil beneath the paint. It was them captured not as strangers, but as something eternal. Two souls meeting mid-journey, bound by a moment. Neither had planned, yet both would carry forever. His vision blurred. He placed the drawing beside his wife's picture. For a long time he just sat there. The house was silent except for the wind against the glass and the soft rush of waves below. Then unexpectedly, he felt it, the weight in his chest, loosening the long-held grief, shifting into something gentler. A single tear slid down his cheek, then another. It had been 3 years since he'd cried. He whispered softly into the quiet, as if speaking to both women at once. She draws the way you used to listen. That night he walked outside. The air smelled of pine and salt. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, each wave catching silver before disappearing into black. He looked up at the stars and thought of Harper, somewhere in Brooklyn, maybe sketching under the same sky. The world for once didn't feel so large. In her apartment, Harper couldn't sleep either. She sat by the window with her sketchbook on her knees, the city humming faintly below. She imagined the letter reaching him, imagined his reaction, the way he might smile or close his eyes, the way he did when words were too much. The thought warmed her. She turned to a blank page and began to draw again, this time, not the train, not reflections, but a horizon. A line where the sea met the sky. It was simple, endless. She labeled it the sound of kindness. Days passed. The check still sat uncashed on her desk, though she finally used a small portion to buy art supplies. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about building something that could speak the same quiet language she had shared with Adrian. She spent the next few weeks painting non-stop, losing track of time. Each canvas carried a piece of that train ride, the warmth of a stranger's shoulder, the echo of a conversation about loss, the hush between two people who didn't need to fill silence to feel seen. Meanwhile, in Maine, Adrian began something new. He created the Kindness Residency, an artist retreat overlooking the ocean where young painters, musicians, and writers could live and work for free. He called the first cabin the Lane Studio. When the sign was installed, he stood in front of it for a long time, letting the wind whip through his hair. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt something close to peace. One evening, he took Harper's sketch and placed it into a wooden frame he had built himself. He hung it beside the window, overlooking the water. Every morning afterward, the first light of dawn touched the edges of that frame, and the drawing glowed like it was alive. Months later, Harper received another envelope. Inside was a photograph of a small coastal cabin and a note written in the same neat blue ink. The world still needs your eyes. The Lane Studio opens next month. The ocean's waiting for your colors. She pressed the photo to her chest, her heart thudding with something between disbelief and joy. For a long while, she said nothing. Then she smiled the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than happiness. That night, she packed her brushes, her sketchbooks, her mother's old paints, and whispered toward the window, as if the wind could carry her words north. Thank you for keeping your promise to the quiet. In Maine, Adrian sat by the fire, unaware that at that very moment, somewhere hundreds of miles away, Harper had begun another drawing. It was of two hands, one giving, one receiving, and the single word beneath them, redemption. The flame flickered, the waves crashed softly below, and for the first time, both of them slept without ghosts. A full year passed before their worlds crossed again. The seasons turned, and Harper's art began to bloom beyond her tiny Brooklyn studio. Her paintings, once confined to sketchbooks and cheap canvases, now filled the walls of a small Soho gallery. The exhibition was called Reflections of Silence, a name that had come to her one sleepless night as she remembered a train, a coat, and a man who taught her that quiet could be beautiful. The night of the opening, the gallery buzzed with the low murmur of voices, the clink of wine glasses, and the faint sound of a cello in the corner. Critics, collectors, and artists mingled beneath soft golden lights, their eyes drawn to the central piece hanging at the heart of the room. It was her largest painting, yet a scene washed in silver and blue, a train window streaked with rain, two reflections leaning toward each other, and a faint, golden thread running between them. She had named it The Girl on the Train. Harper stood near the entrance, smiling politely as people offered congratulations she could barely process. Her success still felt unreal, like she was borrowing someone else's dream. She wore a simple cream dress and a pendant that had once belonged to her mother. Every few minutes she glanced toward the door, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe she was hoping the man who'd once believed in her would walk through it. Maybe she just wanted to feel that calm again. Outside, the night had just begun to drizzle. A tall figure in a dark wool coat stood under the awning, watching the glow of the gallery through the glass. Adrian hesitated before stepping inside. He hadn't been to a public event in years. Not since he'd sold his company, not since the funeral. But something about this night felt necessary. He crossed the threshold quietly, blending into the crowd. His hair was longer now, streaked faintly with gray, his beard trimmed close. He no longer looked like a man running from noise, but one who had made peace with it. For a moment he simply observed, her laughter light genuine, cut through the hum of conversation. She was standing near one of her canvases, speaking to a journalist, her hands moving animatedly as she explained the story behind her work. He moved closer, but stayed out of view, his eyes tracing the line of her profile, the spark that had not dimmed. Then when she turned slightly, their eyes met. The world went still. The noise of the gallery faded until there was only the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows. Harper froze her breath, catching. For a heartbeat, she thought she had imagined him. But then he smiled that same quiet smile she remembered from the train, the one that had said everything words couldn't. She stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "You came." He nodded, handing her a small cup of latte, the same way he had once done, without asking. "You still forget breakfast," he said. Her eyes filled, a trembling laugh escaping her. "You remembered. I remember everything about that morning," he said softly. "The way you fell asleep, like you hadn't in years. The way the light hit your face. the way silence felt alive. She didn't answer right away. Her throat tightened with emotions she hadn't expected to resurface so sharply. Around them, the room continued to buzz, but they stood in a pocket of stillness, as if time itself had paused. She finally found her voice. "You built the Lane studio," she said. "I saw the photo you sent. It's beautiful." He smiled gently. "I only built the walls. You gave it meaning." She looked down at the cup in her hand, warmth seeping into her palms. "I never spent the grant money," she admitted. "Not at first. I couldn't. It felt too sacred." He tilted his head. "And now," she smiled softly, "now I use it to teach art to children at the community center." "You were right. The world needs kindness more than anything." He felt something swell quietly in his chest, a mix of pride and something far more fragile. They stood before her painting "The Girl on the Train," their reflections merging once more in the glass frame. Adrian looked at it for a long time. "Is this us?" he asked. "It's the moment we stopped being strangers," she replied. "The golden thread, it's what kindness looks like when it takes shape." He nodded slowly, his voice roughened by emotion. "You captured what words never could." She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You gave me back my voice, Adrian. You made me believe again." He shook his head. "No, Harper. You gave it to yourself. I just happened to be on the right train." A soft laugh broke from her lips. They both stood silently after that, watching the painting glow under the warm light. Around them, people began to notice who he was. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Adrian West, billionaire philanthropist. But he didn't seem to hear any of it. His attention was entirely on her on this moment. She finally asked quietly, "Do you ever miss the noise?" "Sometimes," he said, "but only until I find something worth the quiet." And tonight he nodded toward her art. "Tonight I did." A sudden flash from a photographer's camera startled them both, drawing them back into the swirl of conversation. Harper laughed softly, shaking her head. "Come on," she said, leading him toward a quieter corner near the window. They stood there watching raindrops slide down the glass, just like that day on the train. He glanced at her eyes full of warmth. "You've changed," he said. "So have you," she replied. "You smile more now. That's your fault." They both laughed. Then the sound blending with the soft music and the murmur of the crowd. Harper looked out at the city lights beyond the rain. "You know, I think my mother would have liked you." He smiled faintly. "I think she already does." She turned to him, eyes shimmering. For the first time, she didn't feel like a struggling artist or a woman trying to prove her worth. She simply felt seen. The world outside blurred into light and motion, but inside that small gallery time stood still once again. Two worlds once separate now, quietly, meeting in the same reflection. The night of the exhibition ended long after the last guests had left, but Harper and Adrian stayed behind, sitting on the gallery floor, surrounded by canvases and the faint scent of turpentine. The lights had been dimmed to soft gold, leaving the room bathed in a quiet, almost sacred glow. Rain still drummed lightly outside. She had kicked off her shoes, her feet tucked beneath her, as she sat cross-legged beside her own paintings. Adrian sat opposite her, his coat draped over the back of a nearby chair. Neither spoke for a while, as if words might disturb the fragile balance between them. Finally, Harper broke the silence. "I used to think success would heal everything," she said. "That once my name was on a gallery wall, I'd finally feel like I mattered." Adrian studied her face, waiting. "And do you?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. "I feel grateful, not complete. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not meant to be complete, just honest. He nodded. Honesty is rarer than brilliance. She tilted her head, watching him. You speak like someone who's learned that the hard way. Adrian leaned back against the wall, his expression distant. When I built my company, I thought I was creating something that would last forever. I didn't realize that what I was actually building was noise money recognition, endless talking. It took losing someone I loved to understand that what lasts isn't what's loud, it's what's kind. Harper's voice was gentle, and now he smiled faintly. Now I try to build things that breathe. The foundation, the art residencies, small schools. Kindness isn't scalable, but it's sustainable. She watched him carefully. There was no arrogance in his words, no hint of performance, just quiet conviction. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire or benefactor, but as a man trying to reconcile the weight of his past with the grace of the present. He looked at one of her paintings across the room, a simple piece of a child, reaching for the reflection of the moon. What will you build next? He asked. Harper thought for a moment. A space for kids who can't afford art lessons. Maybe call it the Kindness Workshop. He smiled. That sounds like something worth building. She laughed softly. You think the world still has room for that? It has to, Adrian said. Otherwise, what are we even saving? They fell quiet again, listening to the hum of the city beyond the rain-streaked windows. Harper turned to him after a long pause. Do you ever think your wife would be proud of you? He hesitated. I think she'd be glad I finally stopped hiding. She believed in people. She would have liked you, Harper. You remind me of the way she listened. Harper's throat tightened. And I think your wife would have liked you too, the way you are now. He smiled at that, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing me, for not seeing the headlines first. She shrugged lightly. I never Googled you until after you disappeared. He laughed. Good, you met me before the noise. She reached for her sketchbook and opened to a blank page. May I draw you again? She asked. He looked surprised but nodded. She began sketching quickly, her pencil gliding across the paper. Adrian watched her, fascinated by the way her focus softened everything around her. It wasn't vanity that moved him, but the tenderness with which she observed. When she finished, she turned the page toward him. It was not a portrait of power or wealth, but of stillness. His eyes looking past the viewer, as if seeing something distant but hopeful. She had written one line beneath it, the man who taught silence how to sing. Adrian stared at it, speechless. It's beautiful, he murmured. You kept your promise, she said. You let the silence sing again. He folded the sketch carefully, as if afraid to crease it. You know, Harper, he said, when I first met you, I thought you were fragile. Now I see you're one of the strongest people I've ever known. She shook her head. I'm just learning to stay soft in a hard world. That's harder than being strong, he replied. The rain outside began to ease, fading into a slow drip along the windows. Harper leaned her head back against the wall, her voice barely above a whisper. You know, sometimes I think kindness is just a form of remembering that people hurt, that we all just want to be seen. Adrian nodded slowly. That's what this was all about, he said. The grant, the foundation, trying to remember what makes us human. She turned toward him, meeting his eyes. You did more than remember. You gave people a reason to believe again. His gaze softened. So did you. They sat there in the quiet aftermath of everything they'd both lost and found. The city outside pulsed with light and distance, but in that gallery there was only peace. Adrian stood after a while, walking to the window. The streetlights reflected in the puddles below like tiny constellations. He spoke without turning. "You know, I spent years building a life that looked perfect from the outside, but was hollow inside. Tonight, for the first time, I feel like I built something real." Harper walked up beside him. "You did," she said. "You built a bridge between who you were and who you are, between strangers, between kindness and art." He turned to her. "And what did you build, Harper?" She smiled softly. "A home inside my heart, somewhere the noise can't reach." He looked at her then, with quiet wonder, as if realizing that every conversation, every gesture had been leading here to this stillness, to this fragile shared understanding. He reached for her hand, hesitated, then took it gently. Their fingers intertwined naturally without effort. The contact was simple but grounding. "Thank you," he said again, "not for the art, not for the words, but for being here." Harper squeezed his hand lightly. "You thanked me before remember." "On the train, then let me thank you properly," he replied, "for falling asleep when you did." She laughed through a tear. "Best nap of my life." He smiled, and the two of them stood side by side, watching the city breathe beneath the rain-washed glass. The gallery lights flickered off one by one, leaving only the soft glow of her painting in the center. The train, the reflections, the golden thread. It shimmered faintly as if alive. Harper leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a long time neither spoke. In that silence there was no grief, no noise, no past to untangle. There was only the quiet rhythm of two hearts healing in unison. Outside dawn began to stretch across the horizon, and somewhere between darkness and light, both of them understood that kindness once given never truly ends. It just finds a new home. The morning after the exhibition, the city woke under a gentle haze of fog, rolling low over the river. Harper walked along the quiet streets of Manhattan, with her sketchbook tucked beneath her arm, the echoes of the previous night still moving softly through her mind. The gallery had been packed, her name whispered between strangers, her art praised in magazines by dawn. But what stayed with her wasn't the success. It was the look on Adrian's face when he stood before the girl on the train. His reflection merging with hers, just as it had a year ago. She reached the cafe on the corner, the one that opened early enough for dreamers and insomniacs. Side steam curled around the windows, the scent of coffee rich and comforting. She ordered 2 cups, 1 black, 1 latte, and took a seat by the window. The city outside moved slowly, half awake. She opened her sketchbook and turned to a new page, the edges still clean, untouched. She began to draw her pencil, tracing the soft outline of a man seated by a window head, turned toward the light eyes full of quiet purpose. Beneath it, she wrote 4 words, "Some silences never fade." A familiar voice broke her focus. "You're up early, Harper." She looked up to find Adrian standing there, his coat slightly damp from the mist, his smile easy warm. "You found me," she said. He held up a coffee sleeve, stamped with the name of the cafe. "You wrote it in the corner of your sketch last night. I followed it like a map." She laughed softly. "You're terrible at goodbyes, you know." He sat down across from her. "I've had enough of them to last a lifetime." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Around them, the cafe filled with the sounds of early morning spoons, clinking the hiss of milk, frothing the faint hum of jazz. Harper watched the steam rise between them, curling like breath made visible. "So what happens now?" she asked. Adrian looked out the window, considering. I don't know, maybe nothing dramatic. Maybe something quiet. We build what kindness started. Together, if you'll let me. Harper felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the tenderness of the offer. Together, she repeated, tasting the word. It felt like the closing of a circle. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the glint of the river beyond the bridge. She smiled and reached into her bag, pulling out a small envelope. Here, she said. He took it puzzled. Open it later. Promise me. He slipped it into his coat pocket without question. They finished their coffee, watching the city wake around them. When they stepped outside, the air was cool and clean. He walked her toward the subway entrance, their hands brushing twice, before finally meeting. They didn't speak as they walked. They didn't need to. At the corner, she stopped. I have to go set up a workshop in Brooklyn today, she said. The kindness workshop. First class starts in 2 hours. He smiled. Then I'll come by later. I'd like to see what love builds after kindness. She laughed softly. That sounds like the title of a book. Maybe you'll write it? Maybe you'll draw it, he replied. The train roared below them, sending a faint vibration through the ground. She leaned up and kissed his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for the charger, for the coat, for reminding me that quiet isn't empty. He touched her face gently, his voice almost breaking. And thank you for reminding me that silence can still be kind. She turned to go, the crowd swallowing her slowly until she disappeared down the station steps. Adrian stood there for a long moment, hand in his pocket, fingers brushing the envelope she had given him. When he finally opened it later that night, he found a single sketch inside. It showed a train car bathed in sunlight, 2 empty seats side by side, and a small caption written in pencil. Some journeys don't end, they just change tracks. Beneath it, in faint watercolor, was the outline of a heart, drawn as a sound wave, soft, uneven, human. He smiled, feeling something stir in him that wasn't grief or longing, but gratitude. He placed the drawing in the same frame beside her first letter, the 2 pieces now hanging side by side in his study. Over the following months, they built quietly together. Harper taught children who'd never held a paintbrush before, showing them how to turn feelings into color. Adrian expanded the foundation funding programs that taught empathy through art. They never made grand declarations or viral headlines. Their story existed in moments in shared coffee cups, long walks by the river, and letters that spoke the language of gratitude instead of romance. And yet, in every quiet gesture, love grew. Not the kind that burns fast and fades, but the kind that endures like a steady note, carried through distance. 1 year later, at the opening of the Kindness Center in Washington, D.C., Harper stood beside a mural painted by the children she had taught. It was a reimagining of her first sketch, a train window to reflections, and now countless golden threads weaving out into the world. Adrian stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his smile easy, unguarded. When the press asked for a statement, Harper spoke simply. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest echoes. Sometimes the sound of love isn't a word, it's a gesture, a choice, a promise kept. The audience fell silent, and for a brief moment, the whole room seemed to breathe together. That night, long after the lights dimmed, Harper and Adrian walked to the nearby train station. They stood on the platform, listening to the distant rumble of an approaching train. She leaned her head against his shoulder, just as she had on that first journey. The sound of the wheels grew louder, then slowed, then stopped. She whispered, "Do you hear that?" He nodded. It's the same sound he said, the sound of everything beginning again. The doors opened, the soft hiss of air filling the silence. Harper smiled, eyes glistening. "Maybe kindness doesn't just ripple," she said. "Maybe it takes flight." He took her hand, the light from the platform wrapping around them in a warm glow. Together they stepped onto the train. Outside, the world moved on rain. Wind, laughter, lost life. But somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, two souls who had once met by accident learned that the truest kind of love isn't found in noise or grand gestures. It's found in the quiet that follows the place where kindness turns into something everlasting, the place where silence finally sounds like home. If this story touched your heart, even in the smallest way, take a moment right now to do something kind for someone who doesn't expect it. It doesn't have to be grand or dramatic. It can be a smile at a stranger. On the train, a message to someone you miss a cup of coffee, for the tired coworker sitting alone at their desk, or simply forgiving yourself for not being perfect. Because every time you choose kindness over indifference, you change the tone of the world around you, one quiet act at a time. That's what this story was always about. Not money, not success, not power, but connection. The fragile, beautiful kind that happens when two lives collide for a reason neither understands yet both will never forget. Maybe you've met someone like that. Someone who appeared in your life for only a moment, but left a mark that still warms you on cold mornings. Maybe that person didn't even know what they gave you. So here's your chance to pass it forward. Hold the door a little longer. Listen without waiting to speak. Send a message that says, "I'm proud of you," even if it feels awkward. The truth is, most people don't need fixing. They just need reminding that they matter. And you, yes, you have that power. You can be the reason someone still believes in goodness. That's how kindness works. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it just lingers quietly, softening hearts that forgot how to feel. If you believe in that kind of love, if you believe in stories that heal instead of hurt, that make you pause instead of scroll, then you belong here. This is what our channel was made for, to remind you that the world still has softness left in it, that people still choose compassion, and that love, when it's real, never needs to prove itself. It just stays, it just listens, it just builds. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Maybe it's New York or Texas or somewhere far across the ocean where the rain sounds different but means the same thing. Maybe you're on your morning commute. Maybe you're lying in bed, unable to sleep. Maybe you're just looking for something gentle in a world that keeps shouting. Wherever you are, thank you for letting us be part of your evening. Thank you for watching until the end, for staying through the quiet parts, for believing that silence can be beautiful. Don't forget to like this video if it made you feel something, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Every week we share new moments of love, redemption, and humanity, because even when the headlines grow darker, kindness keeps traveling quietly between us. And maybe one day when you least expect it, you'll find yourself sitting next to a stranger who reminds you of this story. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that you've become someone else's reminder that goodness still exists. Till then, keep being kind. Keep building the world you want to live in, one small act, one quiet choice, one heartbeat at a time. You're watching Emma's Stories, where every story reminds us that kindness still matters.